And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 15 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. So tonight, guys, I want to talk about really the romanticized story of Mussolini's rescue off the top of Mount Sasso. And of course, this happened after Mussolini was deposed by the king. There was a fascist Grand Council meeting where a vote of no confidence was placed on the Duce that gave the king sort of a legal authority to remove Mussolini in 1943. Listen, the war was going bad at the time. Inflation had hit southern Italy very hard. Sicilians and those in the southern part of the peninsula were starving, and Italians wanted out of the war. And so the fascist Grand Council met in a time of great political turbulence. There was what some believe a conspiracy of sorts to get the fascist Grand Council to give the king the authority he needed to remove him. To make a long story short, so many members of the fascist Grand Council voted against Mussolini. Mussolini was really stunned by the measure and the move. He was warned by his wife the entire time, don't even show up to this meeting. They're conspiring against you, because that was really Mussolini's story, is how his closest allies always betrayed him at every moment in time. And this was another great example, including his own son-in-law, Ciano Galazzo, voted against Mussolini. Now, we can argue this from two different perspectives. On one hand, was Mussolini being belligerent in this war? The Italians were hurting. Had he led Italy to its own destruction? Yeah, I think you could argue that. On the other hand, to remove Mussolini at that point, it threw Italy into a chaos. And later on, in another book that I have by Richard Lamb entitled War in Italy, 1943 to 1945, A Brutal History, you would see the Germans take their retribution on the Italians for their betrayal. Because the moment Mussolini is deposed by the king, effectively, the Germans lose their southern flank, right? The Italians, and even though the Italians were struggling in that war, they still had a military, and hopefully there was something that could have been done toward the end of that war to alleviate. I think what the Axis powers, at least what Mussolini's perspective was hoping, was a stalemate, that they could go to the table with the Allied powers and try to negotiate out of this thing. But the moment the king removes him, of course, that's all up in the air. And really, that is the moment. And this is the hard part about the Italian side of the story, and which leads to the brutality of the Germans against the Italians in the north, is that the Italian military really disintegrates after the king removes Mussolini from power, right? You have a dictator that has run this country now for some 20 plus years, 21, 22 years. And many of the key posts of the government was run by Mussolini himself. In many ways, it left the entire Italian government in a state of chaos. And next thing you know, the king and the new Italian leader, Badoglio, who happened to be one of Mussolini's generals, are fleeing to the south, as now the Germans are taking their retribution out on the Italians after this betrayal. But, with all that being said, it was after the vote on the Grand Council, and the vote of no confidence, a majority of the fascist Grand Council voted in favor of having confidence in Mussolini, but there was enough votes there. I believe it was like 7 votes against to give the king legitimacy. When Mussolini went home that night of the vote on the fascist Grand Council meeting, he didn't think anything of it. He didn't think there was a conspiracy of any kind going on against him. They had hashed out lots of disputes that night. They went till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He went home, not thinking that this meant anything legitimate for his leadership. And then he was called to the House of Savoy, the House of the King, I believe, a day or two later. And it was there that the king informed Mussolini that he was being relieved of his duty and that Marshal Badoglio would be now the new leader of Italy. Now, the meeting with the king was interesting in the sense that there was a love-hate relationship between Mussolini and the king, because Mussolini had steered Italy out of the Bolshevik Revolution, or a Bolshevik type revolution in Italy. And it was Mussolini that led the fascists in pushing back and really, in many ways, leading Italy to prosperity and to prominence again. Fascism and Mussolini had solved many of the problems that Italy was suffering from, a lot of political chaos prior to 1922, when the March on Rome happened, where the king deputized Mussolini as the head of state. And in many ways, while the king and Mussolini butted heads, oftentimes, the king had he had a close relationship with Mussolini and liked him. That was the bottom line. But as the Italians were starving, literally starving, and being dragged through a war, the king wanted out of this thing. And he felt that Mussolini needed to be removed from power. And Mussolini sat there very quietly. It was a short meeting. And in short, the king informed Mussolini that he was being replaced. Mussolini was kind of stunned, pretty quiet throughout the whole ordeal. He was escorted out by the Carabinieri, right? The police force of the Italians, put into an ambulance and taken away, and then moved around from position to position in strategic areas in order to protect them. The king did inform him that he would protect him. Because at that time, well, by that point, when the moment Mussolini is really relieved from duty, he's a political prisoner in many ways, because everybody wants him, right? The English wanted him, the Americans wanted him, the Russians wanted, everybody wanted him. And so he needed that protection. The question was, would the Italians, would the new Italian leadership kill him as a way to offer an offer of sorts to the Allies as they're looking to get out of the war? But the king was never going to kill Mussolini. Just wasn't going to happen because of the special relationship. I think one of the books I've read, I think it was the Nicholas Farrell book, I could be wrong on this, but they say that there was witnesses that after the king informed Mussolini that he was being relieved and Mussolini was being walked away, that the king, it was said that there was tears in his eyes. That it had come to this point because the king and Mussolini had worked well. Now, there's always issues with this monarchy in Italy anyways, because there was a left of center monarchy, and Mussolini was able to bridge the gap. It was very anti-clerical, and Mussolini bridged the gap between the church and the monarchy in many respects. And so there was a peace process or a healing process that had taken place in the time and reign of Mussolini in Italy. And so when Mussolini's reign comes to an end, you really have chaos that breaks out, because the Italian nation under fascism hadn't had another leader. It didn't have any kind of governmental structure. Mussolini just handled it, right? Mussolini had his people running certain departments and things of that nature. But the moment Mussolini is replaced, well, okay, you put Badoglio in power. Well, who's Badoglio? He's a military general. He's never run a government before. Nobody had ever run a government before in Italy, say for over 2 decades over there. So this was the immediate crisis that began. And that's why I say the moment the Germans feel that the Italians have betrayed them and they're taking their pound of flesh out on the Italian population and the Italian military, you got Badoglio and the king fleeing for the south. It's chaos all of a sudden once Mussolini is replaced. So Mussolini's replaced by Badoglio. They move him from one station to another. Eventually, they decide to take him to the island of Ponzo. I believe the island of Ponzo is on the west coast, on the west side, on the Mediterranean there. It's a small island. They kept him there for a couple days. And what was interesting at Ponzo was that it's where we begin to get some of the first glimpses of Mussolini's reversion of sorts back to his Catholic faith. It is said there that at the island of Ponzo is where he read the book, The Life of Jesus Christ, and he asked the priest at the island if he could say a mass for his deceased son, Bruno. It was there that Hitler sent Mussolini the complete works of Nietzsche, but, as a way of, picking up his spirits, because Hitler had other plans, right? Hitler had plans to get the Duce back, because Hitler was a master of propaganda just as much as anything else. And even though the Italian military was collapsing, and there was still a big, what do you want to call it? Respect. It was said that Hitler has seen Mussolini as an idol. Remember, Mussolini was in power a decade earlier than Hitler was. And it was Hitler that from afar watched Mussolini rise to power long before Mussolini had any idea who Hitler was. And that's why a lot of what the Germans eventually did was copy Italian fascism, sort of the military style governance, the uniforms, the salutes, things of that nature. A lot of it, the Germans copied the Italians. And so he spent a couple of days at Ponzo, and then eventually he's taken up to the top of a mountain called the Gran Sasso. And it was there where they say Mussolini was being watched, protected by Italian police. They say he played cards there. He missed his family. But then comes the story of Hitler needing Mussolini and needing him for propaganda as the war is going bad. Obviously, with Mussolini now out of the way, the Allies have been emboldened, at least publicly, and now it's just Germany all by themselves as the Italians have turned. Well, by that time, the German military had gone into northern and central Italy and had begun to take control. They take retribution out on the Italian military. You start killing lots of Italian soldiers, Italian citizens at that point, and really became an occupying force. In fact, I think it was in the Richard Lamb book, War in Italy, 1943, 1945, where what the Germans did to the Italians was so brutal that it was the equivalent of what the Germans had done in Poland. They had treated the Italians between 43 and 45 just like the Polish. They were brutal at every level. And that was just, and you got to remember there's a history there, right? Because it was the Italians when in World War I, they broke their treaty with the Austrian Empire and the Germans, that many Germans felt that the Italians had betrayed them in World War I. So there already wasn't a great love. And also, too, Nazism and Italian fascism, they were different. And there was not a great respect for one another. Both ideologies were fundamentally different in many different ways. A lot of people want to say they were one and the same thing. They were not. The only thing that really gave Italian fascism and German Nazism any commonality was the two leaders. And that was Hitler's admiration for Mussolini and Mussolini's necessary alliance with the Germans after being pushed away by the British and the Americans. It really was a geopolitical alliance there that is never acknowledged by historians, right? We try to make out fascism and Nazism as the same ideology when they were very different from one another. And so with Mussolini playing cards, they say at the top of Mount Sasso, away from his family, a lot of people didn't know where he was. Rumors were being spread. They purposely kept his identity or his whereabouts hidden. Nobody knew if Mussolini was dead at that point. Badoglio wanted to see how the Italian military would react to the Duce disappearing or being dead, to see if he could garner supports of any kind from the military, because he had to consolidate now the power. He had to fill the vacuum that was left behind by Mussolini. He needed to see where the loyalties of the nations were when you have a nation run effectively by an authoritarian leader. And but for Hitler, he needed a propaganda victory more than anything else. And he called I guess a paratrooper, a paraglider by the name of Otto Skorzeny, who orchestrated a plan to fly into the top of Mount Sasso using gliders. Now, there's a big debate about the rescue at the top of Mount Sasso, because many people said that, well, the Germans control the area, they could have just drove up there, but Hitler was going to make a show of it and use it as a propaganda piece during the midst of the war, which is interesting in and of itself. But Mussolini was probably being guarded by a garrison of 20 different carabinieri. Am I saying that right? And my my Italian is not so good. Well, let me take that back. My Sicilian, I say it in Sicilian, right? That's what I speak, but I think there's more of a, you know, the E's and the I's are more defined in Italian. So the carabinieri, as we used to say, the police, the Italian police. And so Skorzeny gets together a group of 12 paraglider units. These gliders. You also have German troops that are coming up the cable carts up from the bottom of the mountain to the top. They also had kidnapped an Italian general as a sort of a distraction to use when they got there. Now, I'm reading Romano Mussolini's book right now, who describes the event as very conspiratorial, because Romano believes that the rescue at the top of Mount Sasso could not have happened without any support from the big figures in Italy at the time, whether it was Badoglio himself or whether it was the king himself. This is him speculating right now. It had to be pre-planned for many different reasons. And one of the things is that when Skorzeny lands on the top of Mount Sasso with several units of German military, there winds up being no shots fired. Now, the presentation of the Italian general Soletti, his name was, they brought him along with him, and they kind of paraded him out or brought him out as they landed on Sasso. It confused the Italian the carabinieri, the police, saying, okay, wait a minute, they got an Italian general with them, right? It's a bunch of Germans with a bunch of generals. And so what they wound up saying is that there was no shots fired at the top of Mount Sasso. And here come the Germans. They put Mussolini on one of the gliders. Now, the problem they had with the gliders was that there wasn't much of a runway. They actually had to move a bunch of rocks off to clear the runway in order to take off from the top of Mount Sasso. But eventually they moved the rocks aside. There's a lot of laborious work going on there. And they say that paraglider barely made it off the mountain. And Mussolini is rescued, eventually taken to Germany. Was it Munich? I think it might have been Munich, where he met up with his family at that point, with Rochelle and Bruno and Anna Maria, his daughter, and I don't know if Etta was there or not. But what's interesting about it is a couple things. First of all, for Hitler, this was a propaganda victory, right? Like I said, they probably could have just drove a bunch of cars up there and taken him, but the great, Otto Skorzeny rescuing him, the daring plight with gliders and things of that nature made for a better, newspaper story at the time. And for Hitler, he could celebrate the rescuing of the Duce. But For Mussolini, it was interesting because for him, he wanted to go away. He was done with public service. The moment the king had deposed him, he knew his fate. Mussolini had this attitude, and Rochelle talks about this a lot in her book. He was very superstitious, right? Believed in things like the evil eye, which is a big thing. It's kind of a pagan thing in Italy. But Rochelle always talked about how Mussolini believed when something started bad, it could never be turned around, right? It was gonna finish bad, and he had I guess a defeatist attitude in many ways. And so once he gets to Germany and he's reunited with his family at at Hitler's assistance, obviously, to him, he's done with it all. He doesn't got power anymore. He wants to go away into private life. He knows that the Allies are coming up and there's probably going to be problems, but he just wants to go away and spend time with his family. But Hitler didn't go through all this trouble to rescue him just for him to retire and hide and cop out of this thing. And Hitler let him know pretty fast. And that's where we get eventually to the establishment of the Republic of Salo, which was a 600-day regime in the northern central part of Italy that Mussolini was set up as a puppet leader in many respects. But, going through the rescue of Mussolini from the top of Mount Sasso is one of those fanciful stories of the war, of mystery, of intrigue, of romance, not romance, but, just the general idea of the propaganda that was being played, by the war machine itself as propaganda is so vital in any war. We see a lot of that being played by the Americans and the Soviets after the war to establish, right, the moral authority by which the Allies had to justify many of the things that happened in Europe throughout that war. Hitler played the same game. All these militaries play the same game. And so Hitler rescues Mussolini off the top of Mount Sasso, only to again put Mussolini in charge of the Republic of Salo, which we'll have to talk about, which that in itself is a very fascinating story too. Mussolini doesn't retire. He's given 4 battalions of Italian military when he becomes the leader of the Republic of Salo, but it's kind of a short-lived venture as the Allies are now closing in on the northern part of Italy. But for propaganda purposes, the world had witnessed that Hitler had rescued El Duce, and the Axis powers had a moral victory of sorts, especially when they were losing at that moment in history. And, if you have a bunch of military people that are demoralized, they're doing, especially with the Germans retreating from the Eastern Front with Operation Barbarossa going very bad. Hitler needed a pick-me-up for not only the Germans, but also hopefully to reestablish an Italian alliance with the Republic of Salo, because it would have been very difficult without that southern flank. See, the thing with Hitler was he never respected the Mediterranean Sea, right? And sort of the allure and the power of the Mediterranean, something that Mussolini always warned Hitler about, because the Germans were sort of always this landlocked nation, right, with very little access to the oceans. See, while the British were a naval empire that went all over the world, the German Empire always stayed landlocked. And when Hitler decides to go into Russia, it was Mussolini the entire time telling him, listen, we need to defend the Mediterranean because that's where the British and the Americans are going to come from. But Hitler was dead set on going after Stalin and the Soviets over there because of his despisal of the Soviets. And that really cost him not taking that serious. And I guess from Hitler's perspective, he figured that the Italians could always protect the southern flank. Come to find out, the Italian military wasn't quite ready for that war, not as strong as they needed to be. That's why by the time 1943 comes around, and the invasion of Sicily starts in April of 43 to defend from that invasion. Because the Italian military was already in dire straits for a lot of reasons: bad economy, not ready for war, pushed in it faster than what Mussolini had anticipated. Remember when Mussolini cut that deal, the what is it called, the Pact of Steel? He told Hitler he needed 3 to 4 years to move his factories from the north to the south to get his factories out of the bombing lanes that the Allies would come in. He needed time to build his military, his air force, but every time Hitler agreed to something, he broke it really fast with Mussolini. And within a month, Hitler's already attacking Poland. He's attacking Czechoslovakia. He's going into France, and Italy's already playing catch up. You got to remember, Italy spent resources in Ethiopia in 36, 30, and 37 and 38, and resources in helping Franco in the Spanish Civil War between 36 and 39. And so Italy's already been in 2 wars, and they need to rearm. And Mussolini kept telling Hitler, I need time. I need at least 4 years to get it up. And every time Hitler just pushed it and pushed it and pushed it, and effectively put the Italians in a bad position. I think that's in large part, that's part of the failure of the Italian military. That's often never mentioned. And so there you have it there. The rescue of top of Mount Sasso. I think it's an interesting story in and of itself. I think I'll probably touch on at some point the vote of the Fascist Grand Council, which sets up ultimately this rescue of Mussolini. But I think it's one of those things that's a very interesting side story in the greater context of World War II and the propaganda that's needed oftentimes, or at least used by military forces to use propaganda for whatever reason, whether it's for moral legitimacy, whether it's to whatever it may be. So that's in a nutshell. There you have it. Hitler's rescue of Mussolini from Mount Sasso. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank. Let's see here. This was part 15 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. I want to thank you for joining me once again. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.